The ceremonial drums had stopped, and so had Elena's heart. She stood in the center of the great hall, surrounded by 1,000 wolves from every pack in the kingdom. Candles flickered in their iron holders along the stone walls. The scent of pine and winter roses filled the air, meant to symbolize new beginnings and eternal bonds. But all Elena could smell was her own shame, rising off her skin like smoke. Marcus was gone. Her intended mate, the man who had courted her for 6 months, who had whispered promises against her hair and told her she was beautiful despite her low rank, had simply walked away. He had taken one look at the Alpha King seated on the dais above them, turned pale, and fled through the side door without a single word of explanation. The heavy oak door had slammed shut behind him, and the sound echoed through the hall like a death knell. Now Elena stood alone in her mother's wedding gown, the white fabric pooling around her feet, her hand still extended toward empty air where Marcus should have been standing. The silence pressed against her like a physical weight. She could feel 1,000 eyes boring into her back, could hear the whispers beginning to snake through the crowd like poison. "Abandoned at the altar," someone murmured. "How humiliating." "I heard she cannot shift," another voice added, louder now. Perhaps he finally came to his senses. Elena's throat tightened. They were right about one thing. She had never been able to shift into her wolf form, not once in her 23 years. It was a defect she had been born with, a shameful secret that marked her as less than whole. Marcus had sworn it did not matter to him. He had looked into her eyes and promised that he loved her exactly as she was. Apparently, he had been lying. The Grand Priestess cleared her throat from her position near the altar. She was an ancient woman with silver hair and knowing eyes, and even she looked uncomfortable. The mating ceremony could not proceed without both parties present. Everyone knew this. The ritual required the joining of hands, the exchange of vows, the blessing of the moon goddess herself. Without Marcus, there was nothing to bless. "Perhaps," the priestess began carefully, "we should adjourn for the evening. Give the young man time to return and explain his—" "He is not returning!" The voice came from the dais, deep and cold as winter stone. Elena's gaze snapped upward, and her breath caught in her chest. The Alpha King was rising from his throne. She had seen him from a distance when she first entered the hall, a tall figure in black seated above the crowd like a shadow made flesh. But she had been too nervous about her own ceremony to pay him much attention. Now, as he descended the stone steps toward her, she could not look away. King Fenris Blackwood was everything the stories claimed and more. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell past his collar and eyes the color of molten gold. A scar cut across his left cheek, pale against his tan skin, and his expression was utterly unreadable. He moved with the lethal grace of a predator, each step deliberate and controlled. The crowd parted before him like water before a ship's prow. He stopped directly in front of Elena. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, and when she did, something strange passed through her. A warmth that started in her chest and spread outward, a pull she did not understand. Her wolf, dormant and silent for her entire life, stirred for the first time. The king studied her for a long moment. His golden eyes moved across her face, taking in the tears she refused to shed, the stubborn set of her jaw, the way she still stood tall despite her humiliation. Something flickered in his expression, too quick to name. Then he extended his hand toward her, palm up. "The ceremony requires a mate," he said, his voice carrying through the silent hall. "I will stand in his place." Elena stared at his offered hand. The Alpha King, the most powerful wolf in the realm, the man whose name was spoken in whispers and whose temper was legendary, was offering to complete the mating bond with her. A nobody, a defective wolf who could not even shift. The whispers in the crowd had turned to gasps. "Your Majesty," the priestess stammered, "the mating bond is sacred. It cannot be undone. If you complete this ceremony, she will be my queen, the king finished, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. I am aware. Elena's hand trembled at her side. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee this hall in this impossible moment. But something in his golden gaze held her still, something that looked almost like recognition. Why? She whispered, the word escaping before she could stop it. The corner of his mouth lifted, just slightly. It was not quite a smile, but it was close. Because, he said quietly, so only she could hear, I know what it is to be abandoned, and I know what you are, even if you do not. Before she could ask what he meant, she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong, and the world shifted beneath her feet. The dormant wolf inside her opened its eyes. The ceremony passed in a blur of sacred words and moonlight. Elena remembered fragments, the grand priestess binding their hands together with silver ribbon, the king's voice, steady and sure, speaking vows that would tie them together for eternity, the warm press of his palm against hers, anchoring her when she felt like she might float away. And through it all, the strange new presence stirring in her chest, like something waking from a long sleep. When it was over, when the priestess declared them bonded before the moon goddess and all the gathered packs, Elena expected the king to release her hand and walk away. She expected him to explain that this was some sort of political maneuver, a temporary arrangement that would be dissolved once the crowds dispersed. Instead, he tucked her hand into the crook of his arm and led her out of the great hall, through a maze of torch-lit corridors, and into a wing of the castle she had never seen before. The royal quarters. His quarters, which were now, apparently, her quarters as well. You will sleep here tonight, the king said, pushing open a heavy wooden door to reveal a bedchamber larger than her entire family home. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the tapestried walls. The bed was enormous, draped in furs and velvet, and Elena's stomach dropped at the sight of it. I cannot, she blurted out, the words tumbling free before she could stop them. Your Majesty, I do not even know you. This morning I was supposed to marry someone else. I cannot simply climb into your bed and pretend that everything is normal. The king turned to look at her, and for the first time, she saw something other than cold composure in his expression. He looked almost amused. It softened the hard lines of his face and made him seem younger, more human. That bed is for you, he said. I will be sleeping in my study. There is a door connecting the rooms, but it locks from your side. Elena blinked at him, confused. You are giving me your bedchamber? You are my queen now, he said simply. Queens do not sleep on settees. He turned to leave, and Elena felt a surge of panic rise in her throat. Everything was happening too fast. An hour ago, she had been an unwanted bride standing alone in her mother's wedding dress. Now she was queen of the realm, bonded to a man whose reputation made grown wolves tremble, and she did not even understand why. Wait, she called out. Please, I need to understand what happened tonight. Why did you do this? You do not know me. You could have let me leave in disgrace, and it would have cost you nothing. The king paused with his hand on the doorframe. He did not turn around, but she saw his shoulders tense beneath the black fabric of his coat. For a long moment, he said nothing. The fire crackled and popped in the silence. Your intended mate fled because he recognized me, the king finally said, his voice low and rough. We have met before, he and I. He knows what I am capable of, and he knew that if he completed that bond with you, I would have killed him before the night was over. Elena's blood turned to ice. What? Why would you? Because you are mine. The words were quiet, but they landed like a blow. The king turned then, and his golden eyes blazed in the firelight. I have known it since the moment you walked into that hall. My wolf knew it before I did. You are my true mate, Elena, the one the moon goddess created for me, and I will not share you with anyone." Elena stumbled backward, her hip colliding with the edge of a writing desk. Her mind reeled, trying to make sense of what he was saying. True mates were rare, almost legendary. Most wolves went their entire lives without finding theirs. The bond was supposed to be instant and undeniable, a recognition that went deeper than thought or reason. But she had felt nothing when she first saw him. Her wolf had been silent, dormant, the same as always. It was only when he took her hand that something had stirred inside her. "That is not possible," she whispered. "I cannot even shift. I am broken. There is no wolf inside me to recognize anyone." The king crossed the room in 3 long strides, closing the distance between them until he stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He reached up and pressed his palm flat against her chest, right over her racing heart. His touch burned through the thin fabric of her gown. "There is a wolf inside you," he said, his voice dropping to a murmur. "I can feel her. She has been sleeping, waiting for something to wake her, waiting for me." Elena's breath came in shallow gasps. Beneath his hand, beneath her own skin, she felt it again. That strange stirring, that unfamiliar warmth. "What if you are wrong?" she asked. The king's lips curved into something that was almost a smile. "I am never wrong." He released her and stepped back, and Elena nearly collapsed from the sudden absence of his warmth. He was at the door before she could form another coherent thought. "Rest tonight," he said over his shoulder. "Tomorrow we begin." The door closed behind him, and Elena was alone. She pressed her own hand to her chest, feeling her heart pound beneath her palm. The stirring was still there, faint but undeniable. Something was waking inside her, something that had been dormant for 23 years, and she had no idea whether to be terrified or grateful. 3 days passed, and Elena barely saw her new husband. The king spent his days in council meetings and his nights locked in his study, leaving Elena to wander the castle like a ghost in borrowed clothes. The servants treated her with a mixture of fear and pity, bowing low when she passed, but whispering behind her back the moment she turned a corner. She heard fragments of their gossip, enough to piece together what they thought of her. The broken wolf, the charity case, the queen who could not shift. On the 4th morning, Elena decided she had endured enough silence. If the king would not come to her, she would go to him. She marched down to the kitchens, ignored the startled looks from the cooking staff, and prepared a breakfast tray herself. Warm bread, fresh butter, sliced ham, and strong black tea. She carried it through the winding corridors until she reached the door to his study. She knocked twice and entered without waiting for permission. The king looked up from his desk, and for a moment, genuine surprise flickered across his face. He was dressed simply today, his black coat discarded over the back of his chair, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his jaw was rough with stubble. He looked exhausted, almost haggard, and Elena felt an unexpected pang of concern. "You have not eaten," she said, setting the tray down on the edge of his desk. "The kitchen staff told me you have not taken a proper meal in 2 days." The king stared at the tray, then at her. "You went to the kitchens yourself?" "I am not helpless," Elena replied, lifting her chin. "I may not be able to shift, but I am perfectly capable of carrying a tray of food." Something shifted in his expression. The hard lines around his mouth softened, and he leaned back in his chair with what might have been the ghost of a smile. Most queens would have summoned a servant. I am not most queens. Elena pulled a chair from the corner of the room and sat down across from him, uninvited. "And you are avoiding me. I want to know why." The king was silent for a long moment. He picked up a piece of bread from the tray and turned it over in his hands, not eating it, just holding it as if he needed something to do with his fingers. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "I am not avoiding you," he said. I am trying to give you space. You were forced into this bond without warning or choice. I thought perhaps you would prefer distance while you adjusted." Elena blinked, surprised by his answer. She had expected coldness, dismissal, maybe even anger at her intrusion. She had not expected consideration. "That is unexpectedly thoughtful. You sound shocked." "Everyone in this castle is terrified of you," Elena said honestly. "They whisper about your temper, your cruelty. They say you killed your own brother to take the throne." The king's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the cold mask slipped back into place. But then he exhaled slowly and set the bread down on the tray. "My brother tried to poison me," he said flatly. "He put wolfsbane in my wine and watched me convulse on the floor for 3 hours before anyone found me. When I survived, he claimed it was an accident. When he tried again 2 months later, I stopped giving him chances." Elena's stomach lurched. She had heard the rumors, of course. Everyone had. But she had never heard this version of the story, the version where the fearsome Alpha King was the victim before he became the executioner. She looked at him differently now, seeing the weariness behind his golden eyes, the weight he carried in the set of his shoulders. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "I did not know." "No one does." He met her gaze, and something raw flickered in his expression. Vulnerability, quickly hidden. "My brother was charming. Everyone loved him. When I killed him, they assumed the worst of me. I let them. Fear is easier to manage than love." Elena reached across the desk and touched his hand. It was an impulse, born of instinct rather than thought, and she half expected him to pull away. Instead, his fingers turned beneath hers, wrapping around her palm. His grip was warm and strong, and that strange stirring in her chest flared brighter. "You do not frighten me," she said. The king studied her face for a long moment, his golden eyes searching hers. Then his thumb brushed across her knuckles, a touch so gentle it made her breath catch. "You should eat," he said softly. "There is enough here for two." They shared the breakfast in companionable silence, and when Elena finally rose to leave, she caught him watching her with an expression she could not quite name. It was softer than anything she had seen on his face before, almost tender. She was halfway down the corridor when she realized her heart was still racing, and this time it had nothing to do with fear. The breakfasts became a ritual. Every morning, Elena carried a tray to the king's study. Every morning, he cleared a space on his cluttered desk and they ate together. At first, their conversations were careful, circling around safe topics like the weather and the quality of the cook's pastries. But as the days passed, the walls between them began to crumble. She learned that his name was Fenris, though no one had called him that since his mother died. She learned that he hated the taste of honey, but pretended to like it because his cook had perfected a recipe and he did not want to hurt her feelings. She learned that he read poetry in secret, hiding the volumes beneath reports of grain stores and border disputes, and that his favorite poem was about a wolf who fell in love with the moon. In return, she told him things she had never told anyone. She told him about her mother, who had died giving birth to her, and her father, who had blamed Elena for the loss and never let her forget it. She told him about the endless parade of healers and mystics her father had dragged her to, each one poking and prodding and declaring her defective, broken, wrong. She told him about the day her father had finally given up and sold her to Marcus's family in exchange for 3 horses and a plot of farmland. "He sold you," Fenris repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "Like livestock." "I was not worth much more than that to him." Elena shrugged, pretending the words did not still sting after all these years. "A daughter who cannot shift is a burden, not a blessing. At least Marcus's family was willing to take me off his hands." Fenris set down his teacup with a sharp click. His golden eyes had gone dark, and Elena could see the effort it took him to keep his voice level. "If your father were still alive, I would kill him myself." "He died 2 winters ago," Elena said. fell through thin ice on the river. Some said it was an accident, others said it was the goddess's judgment. She paused, then added quietly, "I did not mourn him." The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Fenris reached across the desk and took her hand, the gesture now familiar, almost instinctive. His thumb traced slow circles against her palm, and Elena felt some of the old tightness in her chest begin to loosen. "You deserved better," he said. "You deserved a father who saw your worth, a family who cherished you." "I have you now," Elena said, and then blushed at her own boldness. "I mean, I have this, the castle, a place to belong." But Fenris was looking at her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with heat. "You have me," he said, his voice low and rough. "That is exactly what you have." That afternoon, he took her to the castle library. It was a vast room filled with towering shelves and the musty scent of old paper, and Elena stopped in the doorway, overwhelmed by the sheer number of books. She had never learned to read properly. Her father had seen no point in educating a daughter he intended to sell, and Marcus's family had not cared enough to teach her. "I cannot," she admitted, shame heating her cheeks. "I know some letters, but not enough to make sense of the words." Fenris did not mock her. He did not sigh or shake his head or look at her with pity. He simply pulled a slim volume from the nearest shelf and guided her to a chair by the window. "Then I will teach you," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "We will start with something simple." He opened the book to the first page and pointed to a word. His shoulder brushed against hers as he leaned closer, and Elena could smell him now, pine and wood smoke and something deeper, something that made her wolf stir restlessly beneath her skin. "This word is once," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "It begins every good story." They spent hours in the library that day, Fenris patiently sounding out words while Elena repeated them back, stumbling at first, but growing more confident with each page. By the time the sun began to set, painting the windows in shades of gold and amber, she had read an entire chapter on her own. "You learn quickly," Fenris said, and the pride in his voice made her chest ache with something she could not name. "I have a good teacher." Elena closed the book and looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting. His face was only inches from hers, his golden eyes soft in the fading light. She could see the faint lines at the corners of his mouth, the shadow of stubble along his jaw, the small scar that cut across his cheek. She wanted to touch that scar. She wanted to trace its path with her fingertips and ask him how he got it. She wanted things she had never allowed herself to want before. "Fenris," she whispered, and his eyes darkened at the sound of his name on her lips. "Elena." His voice was rough, almost pained. "If you keep looking at me like that, I am going to do something I promised myself I would not do until you were ready." Her heart hammered against her ribs. What if I am ready? He exhaled sharply, and she watched his control waver. But then he stood, putting distance between them, and the moment shattered like glass. "Not yet," he said quietly. "When I kiss you, I want it to be because you want me, not because you are grateful, not because you feel obligated, because you choose me." He left her alone in the library, surrounded by books and the ghost of his warmth. Elena pressed her fingers to her lips and wondered when wanting him had become so easy. 2 weeks into her new life, the castle held a feast. Elena had not wanted to attend. The thought of standing before the entire court, wearing a crown she had not earned, made her stomach twist with dread. But Fenris had asked her personally, and she found she could not refuse him anything when he looked at her with those golden eyes. The great hall had been transformed since the night of her ill-fated mating ceremony. Garlands of winter roses hung from the rafters, and hundreds of candles cast a warm glow across the stone walls. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats and fresh bread and goblets of spiced wine. The nobles of the realm filled every seat, their finest silks and jewels glittering in the candlelight. Elena wore a gown of deep blue velvet that Fenris had commissioned for her. It hugged her curves and swept the floor when she walked, and when she had emerged from her chambers earlier that evening, he had stopped mid-sentence and stared at her like she was something precious. Now she sat beside him at the high table, picking at her food while the court ate and drank and whispered behind their hands. She could feel their eyes on her, judging, assessing. The broken wolf who had somehow snared the Alpha King. They were waiting for her to fail, to prove that she did not belong here. "They hate me," she murmured, low enough that only Fenris could hear. He leaned closer, his shoulder brushing against hers. "They fear what they do not understand. Give them time." "And if time does not change their minds?" His hand found hers beneath the table, fingers intertwining. "Then I will remind them that their queen is not to be disrespected, loudly, if necessary." Despite her nerves, Elena smiled. She had learned over the past weeks that Fenris's threats were rarely empty, but they were also rarely cruel. He ruled with strength, not brutality, and the more she understood him, the more she admired the man beneath the fearsome reputation. The feast dragged on for hours. There was dancing after the meal, and Fenris led her onto the floor for the first waltz. He held her close, one hand warm against the small of her back, and guided her through the steps with patient grace. Elena had never been taught to dance properly, but with him leading, she did not stumble once. "You are beautiful tonight," he said quietly, his lips close to her ear. "You are beautiful every night, but tonight especially." Heat flooded her cheeks. "You do not need to flatter me." "It is not flattery if it is true." The music swelled around them, and Elena let herself lean into his embrace. She could feel his heartbeat beneath his coat, steady and strong, and her own heart raced to match it. The wolf inside her stirred, pressing against her ribs, and for a moment she could almost feel its shape, its presence, like something trying to break through a locked door. When the dance ended, Fenris led her out onto a balcony overlooking the castle gardens. The night air was cold and crisp, and the moon hung full and bright above them, casting silver light across the snow-dusted grounds. Elena shivered, and Fenris immediately shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. It smelled like him, pine and wood smoke, and she pulled it tighter around herself. "I need to tell you something," she said, before she could lose her nerve. Fenris turned to face her, his expression open and waiting. The moonlight caught the scar on his cheek, and Elena reached up without thinking to trace its path with her fingertips. He went very still beneath her touch, barely breathing. "I am not grateful," she said softly. "I am not here because I feel obligated, or because I had no other choice. I am here because I want to be. Because when I am with you, I feel like myself for the first time in my life. Because you look at me like I am whole, even though I have spent my entire existence being told that I am broken." Fenris caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm, his eyes never leaving hers. "Elena." "I choose you," she whispered. "I choose this. I choose us." Something broke open in his expression, raw and desperate and full of longing. He cupped her face in both hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones, and for a heartbeat they simply stood there, breath mingling in the cold air. "I have wanted you since the moment I saw you," he said, his voice rough, standing alone in that hall, abandoned and afraid, and still so brave. "My wolf knew you were mine before I even understood what I was feeling. I have been fighting myself every day since then, trying to give you time, trying to be patient." "Stop fighting," Elena said. She rose onto her toes and kissed him. His response was immediate and overwhelming. He pulled her against him, one hand fisting in her hair, the other pressed flat against her back, and kissed her like she was the air he needed to breathe. Elena melted into him, her fingers clutching the front of his shirt, and the wolf inside her howled with joy. When they finally broke apart, both gasping for breath, Fenris rested his forehead against hers and laughed. It was a soft, disbelieving sound, and Elena realized she had never heard him laugh before. "My queen," he murmured against her lips. "My mate." Elena smiled, her heart so full it ached. "My king." From inside the hall, the music played on, but neither of them moved to return to the feast. They stayed on the balcony, wrapped in each other's arms, while the moon watched over them like a blessing. It was the happiest night of Elena's life. She did not know it would be the last peaceful night she would have for a very long time. The woman arrived 3 days after the feast. Elena was in the library, practicing her reading, when the commotion began. Shouting voices echoed through the corridors, followed by the thunder of hooves in the courtyard below. She set her book aside and moved to the window, watching as a gilded carriage rolled through the castle gates, flanked by a dozen riders in crimson cloaks. By the time she reached the entrance hall, a crowd had already gathered. Servants pressed against the walls, whispering to one another, their eyes fixed on the woman who stood at the center of the marble floor. She was tall and striking, with hair the color of spun gold and a face that belonged in a painting. Her traveling cloak was trimmed with white fur, and jewels glittered at her throat and wrists. She carried herself like someone who expected the world to kneel at her feet. Fenris stood before her, his expression unreadable. Elena's heart stuttered when she saw the way the woman smiled at him, familiar and possessive, like she had every right to be there. "Lady Isolde," Fenris said, his voice carefully neutral. "I was not expecting you." "Clearly not." The woman's gaze swept the hall until it landed on Elena, and something cold flickered in her pale blue eyes. "I heard the most extraordinary rumor, and I simply had to see for myself. They say you took a mate at the winter ceremony, a commoner, a wolf who cannot even shift." The words dripped with barely concealed contempt. Elena felt the sting of them, sharp as a slap, but she forced herself to stand tall. She would not cower before this woman, whoever she was. "The rumors are true," Fenris said. "Elena is my queen and my mate. You will address her with the respect her position demands." Lady Isolde's smile did not waver, but her eyes hardened. "Of course. Forgive me, Your Majesty. I meant no offense." She dipped into a curtsy that was technically proper, but somehow managed to feel mocking. "I am Lady Isolde Ravencrest. The king and I are old friends. Very old friends." The emphasis she placed on the words made Elena's stomach clench. She looked at Fenris, searching his face for some explanation, but he would not meet her eyes. His jaw was tight, his hands curled into fists at his sides. "Lady Isolde was once a candidate for my queen," he said finally, each word sounding like it was being dragged from him. "Before I found my true mate." "A candidate?" Isolde laughed, a bright tinkling sound that grated against Elena's nerves. "Is that what we are calling it now? I seem to remember things rather differently. All those long nights in your study, all those whispered promises." She turned to Elena, her expression dripping with false sympathy. "But I suppose that was before you came along. How fortunate for you." Elena's chest felt like it was being crushed. She knew, logically, that Fenris had existed before she met him. He was a king. Of course there had been other women, other entanglements. But hearing about them from this viper's mouth, seeing the possessive gleam in Isolde's eyes, made something dark and painful twist inside her. "That is enough, Isolde." Fenris's voice cracked through the hall like a whip. "You will be shown to a guest chamber. We will speak later, in private." In private. The words landed like a blow. Elena watched as Isolde was led away by a flustered servant, her golden hair swaying with each deliberate step. At the doorway, she paused and glanced back over her shoulder, her smile widening when she caught Elena watching. The message was clear. This was not over. When the hall had emptied, Elena turned to Fenris. He still would not look at her, and the distance between them felt like a chasm. "Who is she to you?" Elena asked quietly. "She is no one." "That is not an answer." Fenris exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair. When he finally met her gaze, his golden eyes were shadowed with something that looked like guilt. "Before the winter ceremony, my advisors were pressuring me to take a mate. The kingdom needed a queen, and Isolde made her interest known. We spent time together. I considered her." Elena's heart cracked. "You considered making her your queen?" "Yes." The word was barely a whisper. "But then I saw you and everything changed. My wolf recognized you the moment you walked into that hall. Isolde meant nothing after that. She means nothing now." "Then why is she here?" He had no answer for that. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating, until Elena could not bear it any longer. "I need to be alone," she said, and walked away before he could stop her. She did not see the satisfaction in Lady Isolde's eyes as she watched from the shadows of the upper gallery, and she did not see the folded letter that Isolde slipped beneath her chamber door that night, filled with lies designed to shatter everything Elena had begun to believe. Elena found the letter the next morning. It was slipped halfway under her door, the paper thick and cream-colored, sealed with unmarked wax. She almost threw it into the fire without reading it. But something made her pause, some instinct she could not name, and she broke the seal with trembling fingers. The handwriting was elegant and feminine. The words were poison. "Dearest Elena," it began, "I write to you not as a rival, but as a woman who understands what it is to be deceived by Fenris Blackwood. You deserve to know the truth, even if it causes you pain. The king did not choose you out of love. He chose you because you are broken. A queen who cannot shift is a queen who poses no threat to his power. He has confided in me many times that he finds the mate bond inconvenient, a leash he never wanted. He took you that night at the ceremony not because his wolf recognized you, but because your humiliation presented an opportunity. A grateful, desperate bride who would never question him, never challenge him, never be strong enough to leave him. You are not his true mate, Elena. You are his convenient solution. Ask him about the ritual. Ask him what the high priestess told him before the ceremony. Ask him why he really intervened that night. And when he lies to you, as he surely will, remember that I tried to warn you. With deepest sympathy, a friend." Elena read the letter 3 times. Each time the words cut deeper, finding every wound she had tried to heal, every fear she had tried to bury. She thought of how quickly Fenris had stepped forward that night. She thought of how he had known Marcus would flee, as if the whole thing had been arranged. She thought of all the times he had called her his mate, his queen, and wondered if any of it had been real. The wolf inside her, so newly awakened, whimpered and retreated into silence. She did not go to breakfast that morning. She did not go to the library or the study or any of the places where Fenris might find her. Instead, she packed a small bag with the few belongings she had brought to the castle, the clothes she had worn before she became queen, and waited until nightfall. Fenris came to her door twice. The first time, he knocked and called her name, his voice tight with concern. The second time, he simply stood outside for what felt like hours, his shadow visible beneath the door. Elena pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from crying out, to keep from running to him and begging him to tell her it was all lies, but she could not bear to hear him confirm what the letter had said. She could not bear to see the truth in his golden eyes. When the castle finally fell silent, she slipped out through the servants' passages and made her way to the stables. The night was bitterly cold, and snow had begun to fall, dusting the ground in white. She chose the smallest, oldest horse, one that would not be missed, and led it quietly through the side gate. She did not know where she was going. She only knew that she could not stay. The forest swallowed her within minutes, dark and dense and unfamiliar. Elena rode blindly, letting the horse pick its way through the trees, her tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fall. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to run to Fenris and demand the truth, but the letter's words echoed in her mind like a curse. A queen who cannot shift is a queen who poses no threat. You are not his true mate. You are his convenient solution. She had been a fool to believe she could ever be anything more than what she had always been. Broken, unwanted, a burden to be passed from one hand to another. The horse stumbled, and Elena barely managed to keep her seat. She was so lost in her misery that she did not notice the figures emerging from the shadows until it was too late. 3 men, rough and scarred, with the yellow eyes of rogues who had abandoned their packs. They surrounded her before she could flee, their grins sharp and hungry in the moonlight. "Well, well," the largest one said, reaching up to grab her horse's bridle. "What do we have here? A little queen, all alone in the woods." Elena's blood turned to ice. They knew who she was. They had been waiting for her. And as the rogue pulled her from the saddle and threw her into the snow, she realized with horrible clarity that the letter had not just been lies. It had been a trap. The snow soaked through Elena's gown as she struggled to rise, but a heavy boot slammed into her shoulder and pinned her down. The rogue leader loomed over her, his yellow eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. Up close, she could see the scars that crisscrossed his face, the marks of a wolf who had spent years fighting and killing. "Lady Isolde sends her regards," he said, crouching down until his face was inches from hers. His breath was foul, reeking of blood and rotting meat. "She paid us handsomely to make this look like a tragic accident. The poor little queen, wandering into the woods alone, torn apart by wild animals. So sad, so preventable." Elena's heart pounded against her ribs. She thought of Fenris, waiting for her in the castle, not knowing where she had gone. She thought of the letter, the lies that had driven her into the darkness. She thought of all the times she had been told she was worthless, broken, a burden, and something inside her snapped. She would not die like this. She would not let Isolde win. "My mate will find you," she said through gritted teeth. "He will tear you apart." The rogue laughed. "Your mate does not even know you are gone. By the time he realizes, there will be nothing left to find." He raised his hand, claws extending from his fingertips, and Elena closed her eyes. She thought of Fenris's golden gaze, the warmth of his hands, the sound of his laugh on the balcony. She thought of the wolf inside her, dormant for so long, and she reached for it with everything she had. "Wake up," she begged. "Please, I need you." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the rogue's claws came slashing down toward her throat, and Elena screamed. The sound that tore from her lips was not human. It was a howl, raw and primal, ripping through the frozen night like a blade. Pain exploded through her body, her bones cracking and reforming, her skin splitting and knitting back together. The world shifted and blurred, colors bleeding into shades of gray and silver, scents sharpening until she could smell every rogue, every tree, every flake of falling snow. When it was over, Elena stood on 4 legs, her white fur bristling, her teeth bared in a snarl. She had shifted. After 23 years, her wolf had finally awakened. The rogues stumbled backward, their arrogance replaced by shock. The leader recovered first, shifting into his own wolf form with a vicious growl, but he was too slow. Elena lunged at him, her jaws closing around his foreleg, and the taste of blood flooded her mouth. He yelped and twisted away, but she was faster than she had ever been in her human form, faster than she had ever dreamed possible. She fought on instinct, her wolf guiding her movements, and when the second rogue tried to flank her, she spun and raked her claws across his muzzle. The third rogue turned to flee, but he made it only 3 steps before a massive black shape exploded from the trees and bore him to the ground. Fenris. His wolf was enormous, twice the size of any she had ever seen, with fur as dark as midnight and eyes that blazed like molten gold. He tore through the fleeing rogue without hesitation, then turned on the leader with a fury that made the earth tremble. The fight was brutal and brief. Within moments, the rogue leader lay motionless in the blood-stained snow, and Fenris stood over his body, chest heaving. Elena shifted back without meaning to, the transformation pulling her human form from the wolf like a hand reaching through water. She collapsed into the snow, naked and shivering, her body aching from the unfamiliar strain. Before she could even try to stand, warm fur pressed against her side, and then Fenris was there in human form, pulling off his coat and wrapping it around her shoulders. Elena. His voice broke on her name. He gathered her into his arms, pulling her against his chest, and she could feel him shaking. I thought I lost you. I felt you through the bond, felt your fear, and I ran. I have never run so fast in my life. She was crying, she realized. Hot tears streamed down her frozen cheeks, and she could not stop them. The letter said you chose me because I was broken, because I could not threaten you. It said I was not your true mate. Fenris pulled back just enough to cup her face in his hands. His golden eyes were bright with unshed tears, and his expression was fierce with desperation. Listen to me. Every word of that letter was a lie. I chose you because my wolf recognized you the moment you walked into that hall. I chose you because when I look at you, I see everything I have ever wanted. You are my true mate, Elena. You are the only woman I will ever love. Isolde, Elena whispered. She wrote the letter. She sent the rogues. Fenris's expression hardened into something cold and deadly. Then Isolde will answer for what she has done, but not tonight. He pressed his forehead to hers, his breath warm against her skin. Tonight, I am taking you home. He lifted her into his arms and carried her through the forest, and Elena let herself collapse against his chest. Her wolf curled contentedly inside her, finally awake, finally whole. She was no longer broken. She never had been. The trial was held in the Great Hall 3 days later. Every noble in the kingdom had been summoned to witness Lady Isolde's judgment. They filled the gallery and pressed against the walls, their whispers echoing off the stone ceiling like the rustle of dead leaves. Elena stood beside Fenris on the raised dais, wearing a gown of silver silk and a crown of winter roses. Her white wolf rested quietly inside her, a warm presence that no longer felt foreign. Isolde knelt in chains at the center of the hall, her golden hair tangled and her fine clothes stained with dirt. She had been found in her chambers the morning after the attack, packing her jewels and preparing to flee. The guards had discovered letters in her desk, correspondence with the rogue pack, payment records, detailed plans to murder the queen and frame it as an accident. She had damned herself with her own hand. Lady Isolde Ravencrest, Fenris said, his voice ringing through the silent hall. You stand accused of treason, conspiracy to commit murder, and attempted assassination of your queen. The evidence against you is overwhelming. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Isolde lifted her head, and even now, even in chains, her eyes blazed with defiance. I did what I had to do, she spat. You were supposed to be mine. We had an understanding, and then this worthless creature walked into the hall and you threw everything away for a wolf who could not even shift. She shifted, Fenris said coldly. She killed 2 of your rogues before I arrived, and she is worth more than you will ever understand. Isolde's face twisted with hatred. She turned her venomous gaze on Elena, her lips curling into a sneer. You think you have won? You think he loves you? He will tire of you eventually. They always do. You are nothing but a novelty, a broken toy he found amusing for a moment. Elena stepped forward, and the hall fell utterly silent. She looked down at the woman who had tried to destroy her, who had fed on her deepest fears and used them as weapons, and she felt nothing but pity. "You are wrong," she said quietly. "I spent my entire life believing I was broken, believing I was worthless, believing that no one would ever truly want me. And then I met Fenris, and he showed me what it means to be loved. Not because I am perfect, but because I am me. You tried to take that from me. You failed." She turned her back on Isolde and walked to Fenris's side. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining, and she felt his pride and love flowing through the mate bond like sunlight. "The sentence is exile," Fenris declared. "You will be stripped of your titles, your lands, and your wealth. You will be escorted to the border and released into the wild lands beyond. If you ever set foot in this kingdom again, you will be executed on sight." The guards dragged Isolde away, her screams of protest echoing through the hall until the doors slammed shut behind her. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. Every eye in the room was fixed on the king and queen. Fenris turned to Elena, and to her shock, he dropped to one knee before her. The gasps that rippled through the crowd were audible. An Alpha King did not kneel, not for anyone. It was unheard of, unprecedented, and yet Fenris knelt before her as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "Elena," he said, his golden eyes shining. "When you came into my life, I was a man who had forgotten how to hope. I had built walls around my heart so high that I thought no one would ever reach me. And then you brought me breakfast." A soft laugh escaped him, and Elena felt tears prickling at her eyes. "You brought me breakfast, and you refused to let me push you away, and you looked at me like I was worth saving. I love you. I love your kindness and your courage and your stubborn refusal to give up on anyone, including me. I know we are already bonded. I know you are already my queen. But I want to do this properly. I want to choose you, the way you chose me." He reached into his coat and withdrew a ring, a simple band of silver set with a moonstone that glowed like captured starlight. "Elena, will you marry me? Not because the ceremony bound us, but because you want to spend the rest of your life with me?" Elena sank to her knees before him, tears streaming down her face. She took his face in her hands and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. 1,000 times, yes." The hall erupted in cheers, and Fenris slipped the ring onto her finger. He pulled her to her feet and kissed her again, deeper this time, and Elena's wolf howled with joy inside her chest. She had found her place. She had found her pack. She had found her home. 1 year later, Elena stood on the same balcony where Fenris had first kissed her. The winter roses were blooming again, their crimson petals bright against the snow-dusted garden below. The moon hung full and silver in the sky, and somewhere in the distance, wolves howled their evening songs. Elena rested her hands on the stone railing and breathed in the cold night air, letting it fill her lungs like a blessing. So much had changed since that terrible night at the mating ceremony. She thought of the girl she had been then, standing alone in her mother's wedding dress, her heart shattering as Marcus fled through the side door. That girl had believed she was broken beyond repair. That girl had thought she would never be wanted, never be loved, never be whole. That girl was gone now, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth. The door behind her opened, and warm arms wrapped around her waist. Fenris pressed a kiss to the curve of her neck, and Elena leaned back into his embrace with a contented sigh. His scent surrounded her, pine and wood smoke and home, and her wolf stirred happily inside her chest. "You should be resting," he murmured against her hair. "The healer said you need to take things easy." Elena smiled and placed her hands over his where they rested on her stomach. Beneath her palms, she could feel the gentle swell that had only begun to show in the past few weeks. Their child, growing strong inside her. A miracle she had never dared to dream of. "I could not sleep," she said. I kept thinking about everything that has happened, everything that brought us here. Fenris turned her gently in his arms so that she faced him. The moonlight caught the scar on his cheek, and Elena reached up to trace its familiar path with her fingertips. He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm, just as he had done that day in the library when she had first begun to fall in love with him. "Do you remember what you said to me that night?" she asked softly. "When you took my hand at the ceremony?" His golden eyes softened with memory. "I said that I knew what you were, even if you did not." "What did you mean?" Fenris smiled, and it was the same smile she had worked so hard to coax from him in those early days, rare and precious, and meant only for her. "I meant that I could see your wolf, sleeping inside you, waiting to be awakened. I meant that I could feel the strength you did not know you had. I meant that you were extraordinary, Elena, and that everyone who had ever told you otherwise was a fool." Tears pricked at her eyes, but they were happy tears now, the only kind she seemed to cry these days. She rose onto her toes and kissed him, slow and deep, pouring all of her love into the press of her lips against his. When they broke apart, Fenris rested his forehead against hers and let out a long, contented breath. "I love you," he said. "My queen, my mate, my everything." "I love you too," Elena whispered back. "My king, my heart, my home." They stood together on the balcony, wrapped in each other's arms, while the moon watched over them and the wolves sang in the distance. And when they finally went inside, hand in hand, Elena glanced back one last time at the place where her new life had truly begun. She had walked into that mating ceremony alone and abandoned. She would never be alone again.